Hi, I'm Portable Orange, call me Port. If you've ever heard of Sporus, you've likely heard some version of this story. Sporus was a beautiful youth whom Nero had castrated and then married. This marriage would last up until Nero's death, which was mere months after the wedding. However, after Nero's death, Sporus' life wouldn't get much better, being passed around to imperial successors like some sort of plaything. Eventually, Emperor Vitellus would order Sporus' very public execution, and that's the end of the story. Although Emperor Vitellus wouldn't actually get the satisfaction of seeing that execution take place. However, for such a wild story, Sporus is basically just a footnote, not appearing in Tacitus at all. And in Plutarch's Suetonius and Dio, the name Sporus only appears 17 times, with 10 of those being in Dio, over half. But even in just those few lines, I found quite a few details that raised a number of questions, and also led me to a source that most people pass over entirely. And by the end of this video, I think you will also have, at the very least, a couple of questions about the official story. So join me for my most crackpot video yet, where I look at a very small amount of information and spend far too much time overanalyzing it. And as a treat, at the end of this video, I'm going to give you a theory that is way more wild than anything I could ever possibly come up with the caveat that that theory is actually published in a journal. As always, my sources can be found in the companion document linked in the video description, but I'll warn you before we get into this, not a lot of scholars have written on this specific topic. Also, I'm just going to put this disclaimer at the top. Normally, I'm not the biggest fan of trigger warnings, but I do want to let you know this video is going to discuss quite a lot of sexual abuse. Sporus first enters the historical record when Nero is touring Greece. Supposedly, Nero laid eyes on the absolute dime piece, who resembled his dead wife, who also supposedly was an absolute dime piece, and Nero falls in love on the spot. Or, well, at least falls in lust on the spot. Both Dio and Suetonius record one of the first things Nero did was castrate Sporus. Now, I know that sounds bad, which is a great way to start a sentence about castration, but this should be viewed in the cultural context of Rome at that time. And at that time, castration was actually somewhat common in specific contexts. Sexual abuse of slaves in ancient Rome was not just common practice, it was a right, at this time at least. Later emperors, most notably Pius, would crack down on certain aspects of sexual relationships with slaves. And to be fair, outright forcing yourself on a slave was usually pretty frowned upon, although I'll emphasize, frowned upon, not illegal. In fact, in another work, Attic Nights, we have a lovely discussion of if a female slave could be returned for being infertile. And if you want to know why infertility would matter in a slave, well, the children of slaves were usually still slaves, so I'll let you figure out how much consent went into that. Now, for the male slaves, a popular trend in Rome around this time, although certainly much older, is that of the puer delicatus, or the beautiful or luxurious young boy. These would be beautiful young boys kept around for a very obvious reason. And sometimes, although not always, these boys would be castrated in an effort to preserve their youthful looks for longer. Now, it wasn't as though Romans as a whole approved of this practice. In fact, we can find many writings speaking out against it. And even the later Emperor Domitian would actually introduce legislation to crack down on the practice. All that is just to show you what the cultural landscape around castration and Roman sexual encounters were around this time. Because again, you have to view Sporus' castration in that context. This is a very bad practice. This is something that we, as modern humans, should outright condemn totally. But in the same way that you look at gladiator games and other kind of Roman blood sports as just a part of their culture, you need to do the same with these kind of sexual practices as well. So in that light, Sporus' castration should not be looked at as some uniquely evil thing that the mad Emperor Nero just did because he was crazy with power. Now, obviously, we don't know Sporus' thoughts about this, but I will point out, if you remember from part 2 of my Roman paganism video, there were examples of men in ancient Rome who were willing to castrate themselves for certain purposes. Specifically, I'm talking about the cult of Cybele, whose priests would castrate themselves. Though that's more like a religious frenzy thing, not like because a master wanted his slave to be prettier, but similar sort of concept.
Also want to bring this up to make one thing clear. I've seen a lot of random blogs, forum posts, and videos saying Sporus was a slave. But as we'll get to, the evidence points to Sporus being free. As puer delicati were normally slaves, Sporus may not have been considered one. This is more to show there was a space within pre-existing Roman culture where the castration would be seen as a tool to preserve Sporus's reported beauty.
Though, just to caveat again, it's not weird for you to hear me say this and then say there's no way anyone could ever possibly be okay with something like that. That's fair. You're probably going to be tempted a lot throughout the story to apply a lens of modern morality on the story that we're going to be going through. And while there's nothing wrong with being repulsed by some of these actions or thinking some of these are morally abhorrent, you do need to take them in the cultural context in which they're happening. Now, if you made it through the section of me saying, don't worry, castration actually wasn't that bad, first off, thank you. But just a heads up, that's probably not even going to be my worst take in this entire video. So let's get to it. So picking back up, Nero now marries Sporus, and Dio would relate to us that this marriage was a full-on traditional and legal Greek marriage. This included the giving away of the bride, the giving of a dowry, and, although maybe Dio's like poking fun at this, a prayer for the conception of legitimate children. Now, if you've seen my Nero video, aside from knowing that I am a massive Nero apologist, you'll also know that Nero was a massive Greekaboo. He was obsessed with Greek culture. And so therefore, to my mind at least, this traditional Greek marriage, even complete with the prayer for legitimate children, actually kind of makes sense. It's in line with what Nero would have wanted. Dio and Suetonius would both note that Nero and Sporus would appear in public together, seeming a very happy couple, constantly kissing each other in public and somewhat passionately as well. Many will argue that this wasn't by choice, which is a fair argument to make, but I think by the end of this video, you'll understand why I sort of have some questions about that version of things. Now, one other note from this section, Dio claims that when Nero went to Greece, he left his freedman Helius in charge of Rome, and that freedman would then abuse his power to rob the city blind. Dio uses this as an excuse to name several other members of Nero's entourage who would also abuse their power for personal gain, going on to say, as regards to Gelinus, I consider him a mere appendage of Nero, because he was constantly with him. But Polyclitus and Calvia Crispinilla, apart from Nero, plundered, sacked, and despoiled everything it was possible to pillage. The former was associated with Helius at Rome, and the latter with Sabina, who was known as Sporus. Calvia had been entrusted with the care of the boy and with the oversight of the wardrobe, though a woman and of high rank, and through her all were stripped of their possessions. So the thing I want to highlight here is Dio's claim that Calvia was apart from Nero and also acting as Sporus's handmaiden, which would imply that Sporus and Calvia were with each other and also apart from Nero. This may, and I really want to stress the word may, imply that Sporus had a little more freedom than the standard story often depicts. Now, to be fair, this doesn't necessarily mean that. Calvia's association with Sporus could have come after she was robbing people blind. And, also to be fair, she would eventually end up stirring up a rebellion in Africa. So it's possible that she was traveling with Nero while in Greece, ended up souring on Nero, and then went to Africa and would live out the rest of her life down there. Now, if you've been paying attention, you may notice that I have yet to use a pronoun for Sporus, and that has been very much intentional, because Sporus's gender identity is actually something I've kind of gone back and forth on. At the risk of giving the game away, all the way up through my first 2 drafts of my script, I used exclusively male pronouns for Sporus, because to my mind, at least, that's what made the most sense. Nero was the one who would initially start referring to Sporus with a female name and female titles. And I think we can agree that probably, in some capacity at least, was a twisted version of Morn. And so I don't know that we should take that as any evidence of any underlying gender identity. And given that all the later historians would use the male name Sporus, to me, that kind of settled the matter. That was that, and I moved on. But about halfway through my 3rd draft, I sat with it a little bit more, and well, my feelings are actually a bit more mixed now. Spoiler alert for something that happened 2,000 years ago, Nero does end up dying. But the interesting thing is Sporus's next partner also refers to Sporus with the female name Sabina and supposedly treats Sporus as a wife, not like a puer delicatis or some other type of concubine. Sporus would frequently be seen in public dressed as a woman and with a full entourage. Similarly, Dio would use a term when referring to Sporus's 3rd relationship that would imply the relationship of a married couple. Although, to be fair, Dio could just be being literary with it. It's not completely wrong to just dismiss it for that reason. A lot of the argument is going to have to come up in the analysis section, because you're kind of going to need to know the whole story beforehand. But Just so you know, going forward, I will be using female pronouns to refer to Sporus. However, mostly to avoid confusion with Nero's ex-wife, I will still be referring to her as Sporus. I'm sure that decision will annoy some of you. In fact, coupled with the potential dead naming, probably all of you. But that is just what made the most sense to me when I looked into everything. All that being said, if you choose to read a male identity into Sporus and disagree with me, frankly, you're well within your rights. If you assume the Sporus was abused and then died angle, it's pretty easy to look at her female identity as being part of that abuse. And me choosing to use female pronouns is just continuing that abuse. I don't think that's a terrible opinion to take. And ultimately, given how little was written about Sporus, we're never going to know one way or the other. I say all this just to show you that everyone has biases, including me, and it's not unreasonable for you to disagree with me on something like this when we have so little to go on in the first place. That's why I harp on the companion document so much. I want to encourage you to engage with my sources and read them for yourself, and it's fine if you come to your own conclusions and those conclusions disagree with mine. Because at the end of the day, these videos are just me making sense of the evidence that I found and then telling you guys that story. Now, as much as I'd like to say, I'll link some scholars in the companion doc so that you can read both sides of the argument, I just have not been able to find really any scholars discussing Sporus's gender identity. Although to be clear, scholars, there's plenty of random blogs if you just want to Google it. But we're very much in uncharted territory here from a scholarly perspective. But to wrap it up, we're forging ahead under the assumption that Sporus had some form of female identity to go along with her female presentation. Good? Yes? No? Too bad. Can't hear you. It's a video. Moving on. Now, the wedding happens in 67 AD, and Nero is dead by 68. So there's really only one other story that we have that involves Sporus from this time period, and it's only recorded in Suetonius. Nero is taking the auspices, recall, vibe-checking the gods, and Sporus gives Nero a ring that depicts the famous scene from Greek myth where Hades takes Persephone to the underworld. Although they use a different word for takes, and it's a word YouTube won't let me say.
Just real quick, if you're unfamiliar, Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of agriculture and spring. Hades thinks she's hot, so one day kidnaps her to marry her. Persephone decides to have a little snack before she can get rescued, so she has to spend either 3 or 6 months in Hades a year. Moral of the story, moment on the lips, lifetime on the hips.
Now, my first thought when I read this is one I'm sure many of you have as well. That Sporus is, in a way, sort of mocking Nero, presenting a ring with a story that has very clear parallels of what happened to Sporus. And Suetonius even presents this in a list of bad omens that Nero ignored, omens which supposedly were predicting the end of Nero's reign. But interestingly, Suetonius specifically uses the Latin word munere, a word which means gift or present, but actually comes from the idea of a duty. So this very noble word referring to essentially a Roman virtue, which doesn't really make this scene seem as if it was supposed to be mocking necessarily. So framing it in a somewhat positive light. And frankly, knowing what I do of Nero, I don't actually think he would have hated this gift or even been embarrassed by it. After he was accused of killing his mother, he frequently would take to the stage and play characters who, in their own stories, also killed their own mother. So it seems like Nero was not only happy to play the villain, but even enjoyed it and enjoyed leaning into some bad depictions of him, a habit which probably was not the most far-sighted habit. At the end of all this, I didn't think it was that weird to take Suetonius at his word and view the ring as just a gift. And again, one Nero might have liked. We'll come back to it in the theory section, but I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind for right now. Our next glimpse of Sporus is as Nero flees Rome, so let's go over that story. Suetonius and Dio, our main sources for this night, mostly agree with each other, and the details they quibble on don't really affect Sporus, so I'm just going to give like a hybrid version of their stories. When Nero learns that one of his top guys has turned on him and the Senate has declared for Galba as the new emperor, Nero chooses to flee Rome, initially planning to go to Egypt, but when that plan doesn't work out, he instead goes to the villa of one of his freedmen, taking with him a small retinue of 4 people, one of whom was Sporus. After some running and hiding, Nero decides going out on his own terms is a better end than letting the mob have him. And so, after a Neronian amount of drama, manages to finish himself off. And also potentially was trying to convince either just Sporus or the entire retinue to kill themselves with Nero, but that did not end up working. After his death, Nero's body would actually not be given to the mob, but rather cremated in the traditional fashion. However, according to Plutarch, before Nero's body was even done burning, Sporus was already shacking up with the new man who held power in Rome, Nymphidius Sabinus. Though there was never an official marriage ceremony, Plutarch goes out of his way to say that after Nymphidius sent for Sporus, he treated her just like a wife.
My Greek is horrendous, but briefly, this word means husband, but the actual word here is tricky. While it means husband, the diacritics are slightly wrong, and the root of this word can mean to marry or to take to wife. Coupled with Nymphidius choosing the female name of Poppaea for Sporus, makes me think either Nymphidius is possessing her as a husband, or I'm missing some nuance in Attic Greek the comments will undoubtedly fill me in on. It's possible Sporus was the husband, but I'm skeptical of that given how in traditional Roman society, even something like a marriage ceremony between two men involved one playing the bride or woman. And I highly doubt Nymphidius would have been the woman.
Nymphidius was the head of the Praetorian Guard, whom you could think of as like the secret service of ancient Rome. They were supposedly under direct control of the emperor, although they would also provide protection to senators and other important figures as needed. While he had been appointed to this position by Nero, he had turned on Nero and said that the soldiers should support Galba instead, saying they would likely receive a large monetary reward if they did so. Now, as Galba was in Spain when he was proclaimed emperor, Nymphidius was the only one in the city who had the loyalty of all the men with swords. So, even though he wasn't emperor at the time, he certainly had a lot of power. Now, Nymphidius was supposedly staunchly anti-Nero, even turning a blind eye to the mobs that would go around the city trying to kill anyone who had been even remotely pro-Nero. So, it's kind of odd that one of the first things he'd do would be to shack up with Nero's former spouse. Nymphidius is even recorded calling Sporus Poppaea, just as Nero had. Plutarch even claims Nymphidius saw Sporus as his reward for overthrowing Nero, specifically saying he thought himself insufficiently rewarded by the honors and wealth that he enjoyed, and by the company of Sporus. By the way, that's it. That one sentence is the only evidence we have of their relationship. Neither Suetonius nor Dio mention it at all, although, to be fair, Nymphidius plays a much smaller role in their versions of the story, so it's not that weird, but thought it worth mentioning. But with Sporus still not having a speaking role, we kind of just have to surmise her feelings from, again, this single line. Now, Nymphidius would eventually make a play for the imperial throne and actually looked like he was going to pull it off. He even had a time where he was going to go into the camp and the soldiers were going to declare him emperor. But then one soldier starts yapping about honor and duty or something stupid like that, and it just kind of kills the vibe, so when Nymphidius shows up, the soldiers just kill him instead. Thus, Galba became the undisputed ruler of Rome, for like 6 months anyway. Now, aside from the one line in Plutarch mentioning the relationship with Nymphidius, we don't actually have any record of what Sporus was doing during the rest of Galba's reign. We do know she'd survive it, and there's one detail about Galba I want to highlight before moving on. Supposedly, after this conspiracy was uncovered, Galba went to extreme lengths to execute anyone even remotely involved in it. Suetonius relates the Praetorian Guard was terrified of his purges because Galba would just claim some of them were either Nymphidius supporters or had been involved in the coup directly. And he was quite worried about Nero's men too, decimating or killing 1 in 10 oarsmen whom Nero had elevated to soldiers who now didn't want to go back to being oarsmen. Tacitus and Dio describe similar stories, but they do caveat that Galba is not actually to blame for these events, that it was Galba's freedmen who he'd put in charge and then hadn't really monitored very well. So these executions were carried out by them and not by Galba himself. Plutarch claims all these executions were seen as both illegal and despotic. And one in particular, Turpilianus, a faithful of Nero, was actually put to death without a trial, not even being afforded the chance to speak in his own defense, which Tacitus records made most people think that he was innocent. Again, we'll return to why I find that relevant in the theory section, but just remember, Galba did some very violent purges of Nymphidius and Nero supporters when he did actually come to power. Now, Galba would commit the classic blunder of naming the wrong person his heir, and so his eventual successor, Otho, would fix that mistake by killing Galba and taking his place. Otho had actually already been in the historical record for a while, supposedly being a favorite of Emperor Nero's back in the day, when he was married to Poppaea, recall Nero's favorite wife. Eventually, the two have a falling out, again, presumably over Nero's love of Poppaea, and Nero would semi-banish Otho, sending him to be the governor of a distant province. So, not like a real banishment in that sense, but he certainly wasn't allowed to return to Rome. Now, some of the ancient writers claim that that was all political theater, that Otho and Nero actually were great friends, and the plan had always been for Nero to end up marrying Poppaea. And I think a lot of that stems from the way in which Otho ruled, because for someone who was banished by the guy, he was surprisingly pro-Nero. He allowed people to put up statues of Nero, he reappointed some of Nero's appointees, And he'd even protect some people from Nero's administration from the public outcry they were facing. Most interestingly, he even flirted with adding Nero's name to his own. Suetonius and Plutarch record that Otho did not object to being called Nero Otho and would go on to start signing official documents Nero Otho. Although, when people didn't receive this that well, he did apparently stop the practice. Dio and Tacitus, on the other hand, give slightly different versions. Dio goes much farther, claiming that Otho added Nero's name to his own immediately after he took the throne, that it was his idea and he pushed it until it was eventually rejected. Whereas Tacitus claims that he didn't want to acknowledge the title when the crowds hailed him Nero Otho, but he also didn't want to outlaw it for fear of public backlash, and so never officially adopted the title. Regardless of his feelings about Nero, Dio would record that he would appear in public with Sporus, specifically using that Greek word that would imply their relationship was that of a husband and wife, or at the very least some kind of concubinage. So potentially another treated like a wife kind of relationship. See, it was the little details like this that eventually brought me around on the gender identity thing. Although again, if you want to view this as just being some form of like concubinage, I think that's how most people view it. In fact, I'm almost 90% certain that's what's on the Wikipedia for Sporus. So you're well within your rights to interpret it that way as well. Now, Otho would make the twin mistakes of not being good at ruling or battle, and so we'd end up with the last emperor Sporus would see come to power, the Emperor Vitellus. Now, Vitellus would be the one to eventually order Sporus's execution. But what's most interesting to me is all the ancient writers, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Dio, all agree that Vitellus was both the most like Nero and the most lenient in terms of his purges. In terms of leniency, Dio opens by saying he was not entirely without good deeds, and then gives several examples, including returning seized funds, forgiving debts, and even sparing most of Otho's followers. One interesting story in particular is when he's having a disagreement with a senator in the Senate, where after a little bit of posturing, he doesn't actually do the senator any harm, and even turns to the rest of the Senate and says, hey, there's no problem, we're just having a disagreement, like, don't get so worried about it. But in the midst of all this leniency and sparing people and loving Nero, he puts Sporus to death. And not just like a standard public trial and execution. No, this is going to be a big show in the arena where Sporus is going to play the role of a maiden being ravished. So basically, Weinstein to death.
I've actually seen a theory this was meant to parallel the ring Sporus gave Nero, the maiden being Persephone in this case. I can't find anything in Dio specifically to support that, but it would make sense if you think about it as revenge.
Rather than endure such a brutal fate, however, she opts to instead go out on her own terms and ensures that Vitellus can never have the satisfaction. So there's two details I want to highlight about Sporus under Vitellus, which again comes down to a single sentence. Firstly, it is arguably the most pro-Nero of the recent emperors who has her executed, while she survived the most anti-Nero. And secondly, she ended her own life. She had the guts to follow through on that. Something that I think is interesting to see only happen now. Granted, you could argue that she was facing death either way at this point, but I'd counter with the fact that in the wake of Nero's death, I don't know that she should have expected she would have been spared. We'll come back to this in a sec, but before we get to theory, I want to touch on the very last piece of evidence we have about Sporus. And it's the one that, to me, throws the most doubt on the traditional view of her story. In one of Dio Chrysostom's orations, he mentions Sporus, though not by name, in two separate paragraphs.
The first section is actually one of the biggest pieces that swayed me towards Sporus and Nero having some positive relationship. Dio Chrysostom specifically refers to Sporus as Nero's eromenos, a word meaning lover. The love is implied to be somewhat deeper than sexual. Chrysostom offers the evidence for my earlier claim that Sporus walked everywhere dressed as a woman, though again he claims this was forced. Still, to me, coupled with Nymphidius continuing to use a female name, stuff like this is what cast enough doubt to tip the scales for me.
For our analysis, I think the second part is a lot more relevant, where he writes, Sporus in anger disclosed the emperor's designs to his retinue, and so they revolted from him and compelled him to make away with himself as best he could. I will note he adds, the truth about this has not come out even yet, which very frustratingly hazes the whole thing, because he's writing like 30-ish years after Nero died. So it's kind of weird that it'd take that long for the truth to come out. And then it's unclear if he's saying, this is what happened, I have secret knowledge, and the truth of that knowledge has not been revealed to most people yet, which to me would cast an enormous amount of skepticism on those claims. But what he might be saying instead is, this is what happened, we know what happened, but we don't know the specific details of how it happened. The truth has not come out even yet. But I only mention all this to show you how complicated all this is, and again, feel free to check the sources, figure everything out for yourself, and come to your own conclusions. But if you don't want to come to your own conclusions, feel free to listen to some of mine, which we'll get to right now. Let's begin with Sporus' gender identity, something that, again, I'm still a little tenuous on. I've gone back and forth on this several times. Firstly, there's the obvious question of why Sporus would continue to be referred to by these female terms after Nero's death. If indeed Sporus' female presentation was only something that Nero wanted, why then would Nymphidius Sabinus treat Sporus as a wife? Why then would Otho engage in a sort of concubinage that might imply a traditional male-female marriage? And in the end, why would Vitellus have Sporus play the role of a maiden? Again, you can imply that all of these were meant to be humiliating or seizing power or demonstrating power in various ways. But the thing that I'm going to push back on is the fact that Sporus did seem to have some amount of political capital. Now, again, if you want to take the standard view here, you can, and assume that it was entirely abusive for every single person. But again, then I just question, like, was something in the water? Why was every single person from Nymphidius Sabinus to Otho choosing to treat Sporus as a woman, as opposed to just a puer delicatus? Again, a practice which was quite common in Rome around this time. Weirdly, I think a lot of the standard model comes from that idea of putting yourself in Sporus' shoes with modern sensibilities and modern morality. And it does sort of make sense. Like if someone came to me and said, hey, Port, do you want to be First Lady of the United States? You just have to get castrated. That's the only thing you need to do. I'd probably be like, no, I'm good. You know, I'm going to not probably. I would say no. If someone can somehow offer me that deal, I'm not taking it. Do not offer it. But that's not to imply that there's no one who would take a deal like that. Especially, again, if you assume someone whose gender identity is, I think at the very least, up for debate. This, to me, paints a picture of a freed woman who very much enjoyed being empress. She enjoyed the wealth. She enjoyed the power. Heck, she probably enjoyed the attention to a certain extent. In fact, in a very, very cynical analysis of this, I don't think it's entirely wrong to call Sporus a gold digger. Now, to push back against myself a little bit, I'm not trying to argue that Sporus was an equal partner in these relationships. Certainly when it came to Nero, and almost certainly with Nymphidius and Otho as well, Sporus was not in the driver's seat for those relationships. But I think one of the problems is Sporus gets stripped of all agency because when you start with the abuse, there's kind of nowhere else to go to. And that lack of agency gets really hard to square with things like Dio Chrysostom's claim that Sporus was the one who eventually did Nero in. And this is to say nothing of the difficulty of not only surviving each of these purges, but kind of ending up with the top guy a couple times in a row. All this to say that, while of course you're always welcome to assume the standard version of events is true, and I'm just going on another crazy Nero apologist video, you do have to contend with some issues if you want to take that route. I'd encourage you to try and engage with the underlying material yourself a little bit. Again, feel free to check the companion doc. It is 17 sentences. It will not take you that long to... You know what, actually? At this footnote, I'm going to type up every single sentence we have on Sporus, so you can just go there and read it all for yourself. That is every piece of evidence we have. It should take you less than 5 minutes to read. But again, if you want to just go with these scholars have studied this more than I have, and therefore I'm just going to trust them on this, and I'm not going to trust some random dude on YouTube, that's fair. But if you have made it this far, I assume you're at least a little interested in what I think happened, so let's get into that. I do think it's pretty clear that at some point Sporus turned on Nero, at the very least due to how the anti-Nero emperors embraced her and the pro-Nero emperor would have her executed. And while I don't think we can pinpoint exactly when that happened, I think we can be almost certain it happened before Nero's death. Suetonius and Dio both claim that when Nero realized the end was unavoidable, he wanted the rest of his entourage to end themselves with him, if not before him. Taking Dio Chrysostom's, frankly, throwaway line about Sporus convincing everyone to turn on Nero, I think we can paint a pretty good theoretical picture of what happened. Again, I want to stress, theoretical. Nero, hidden away from Rome in that villa, decides that the end has truly come and there's no way out for him. And he thinks it'd be quite poetic if not just he died, but everyone with him as well, much like what would happen in a Greek tragedy. Sporus, upon hearing this, gets understandably pissed and then tells everyone else. I actually like to imagine her yelling at Nero like, "This isn't a play, Nero. You need to face reality." Facing reality, of course, if you saw my Nero video, was something that he struggled with basically his entire life. She then tells everyone else, and I like to imagine them saying, look, Nero would be cool, would be based, would be Chad if we all did this, but we're not. Nero, facing reality for what potentially was the very first time, does take his own way out. Now, therefore, when she gets back, Nymphidius Sabinus might have heard this story and said, "Ah, I see the Empress has also turned on Nero. Perhaps I can demonstrate my power and even give myself a claim to the throne by bedding the former emperor's wife." Now, I imagine Sporus would have no issue going along with this because, in addition to getting to maintain the level of comfort she'd become accustomed to, she also would receive protection from those mobs roaming the city, just killing anyone who even looked like they might have liked Nero. So, kind of a win-win for her on that one. Sporus had been associated with both Nero and Nymphidius, yet was never targeted during any of Galba's purges, at least that we know of. I think, though, if you think of Sporus as maybe having some type of political capital at this point, it can make sense. I almost wonder if getting with Nymphidius didn't cement Sporus as a kingmaker in a sense. Sporus had the ability to sort of lend credence and political power to whichever person was trying to rule Rome. It's not unreasonable to think that Sporus, maybe not a full like kingmaker or anything like that, but might have had some real political power just in terms of swaying the common Roman citizen over to your side. Again, it's not unreasonable to say that I might be reaching here because we only have 3 sentences to go on at this point. But if you want to take a different interpretation than me, you're still going to have to explain how Sporus could have survived Galba's reign. And if you'd like to do so, I will put it at this footnote, so feel free to tell me in the comments. This would also mean that she could actually have had real allies that could have protected her from Galba's purges. And these allies would have had to have been a lot stronger than some of the other people who were not so lucky. Then when Otho comes to power, Sporus is again able to pull this kind of concubinage relationship with the strongest guy in town. While some part of this was probably because, again, hot, I also think that Sporus's popularity with the masses genuinely might have been an important tool for maintaining rule at this point in the Civil War. Again, I do think it's interesting that the later historians, when writing about Sporus, seem to have pity or sympathy. There doesn't really seem to be a lot of derision against this individual who, I think we can agree, broke a lot of social norms in ancient Rome. Again, feel free to say I'm just grasping at straws, but to me this paints the picture of someone who did see popular support that was so strong, even years after their death, historians were still writing about her. Then finally, when Vitellus comes to power, someone who admired Nero more than anyone else, Sporus is suddenly executed. And this execution supposedly didn't happen right away. Dio claims it didn't happen until several months into Vitellus' reign, so it's even possible there was some political tension there that eventually boiled over. But of course, we'll never know. And, in my view, the easiest explanation is just that as Sporus had turned on Nero, Vitellus wanted to punish her for that. So that's it. That's my crackpot theory, that Sporus had far more agency than is traditionally assigned to her, and actually might have even been a pretty shrewd politician, but was just dealt a losing hand from the get-go, or maybe just overplayed her hand. Like I said, the ending is very, very fuzzy, especially because, again, it's just a single sentence. As with all my videos, you don't have to agree. Feel free, again, to check all those sources and read them for yourself and come to your own conclusions. Now, you're probably looking at the runtime of this video, or you're just listening to the video and you're surprised that, given my tone, that wasn't the end of the video. But if you recall, I told you I was going to share one more crackpot theory with you, one that puts mine to shame. But believe it or not, this was published in a journal by the Latin Study of Brussels, nonetheless. And to top it all off, there's a response paper to this one, so it clearly got some amount of attention. So let's go over the theory that Sporus was actually a Julio-Claudian. This theory is brought to us by David Woods, and you should really all go read this in his own words, because not only am I just giving a very brief summary, I'm also very much holding him up to be like, look, I'm not crazy. Look at this guy. I could be crazy as this guy, and I'm not. So genuinely go check this out if this sounds remotely interesting to you. But a brief summary of his theory goes as follows. Sporus' castration was not due to any cultural practices. It was actually insurance by Nero to get rid of another potential claimant to the Roman throne. You see, Sporus looked like Poppaea. And, as Woods evidences through stories from Valerius Maximus and Pliny the Elder, there is evidence that Romans thought that if people looked alike, they must be related. Which, okay, fine. So Nero thought that Poppaea and Sporus were related. What of it? Poppaea wasn't a Julio-Claudian. She did come from a prestigious family, but certainly not one with imperial ancestry. Now, Nero was related to Claudius. He was a Julio-Claudian himself, after all, But the relationship was quite distant, and his descent from Augustus had been entirely matrilineal, so his claim to the throne was somewhat weak. We also know that Nero wanted to divorce Octavia basically from the get-go, but his advisors would always caution him that she gave him part of his right to rule. Nero would eventually divorce Octavia for Poppaea, but only after Nero and Poppaea had carried on an affair for a number of years. So Woods poses the question of why now? Why did Nero feel comfortable divorcing Octavia now? So Woods theorizes that the reason Nero eventually divorced Octavia was because Poppaea convinced Nero that she was a Julio-Claudian. Woods argues that Poppaea may have argued to Nero that as her father was executed under the reign of Emperor Tiberius, her mother, out of fear of a similar execution, would have gone to the Emperor Tiberius and kind of offered herself to avoid execution, and therefore Poppaea was Tiberius's illegitimate child. Just for the record, the timing on this doesn't really work out. Tiberius went into like a self-imposed exile on the island of Capri in like 26 AD. In fact, he wouldn't have been the one to execute Poppaea's father, who was executed in 31 AD, by the way. That would have been this person, Sejanus, who kind of ruled Rome in Tiberius' stead for a little bit. And Poppaea was born in 30, the year before her father's execution. So again, the timing is just really suspect for all this. However, Woods sidesteps the issue by saying that even if this didn't convince Nero, they might have just used it as an excuse for appearance's sake. However, for Woods' theory to work, Nero did have to believe it in earnest, as he argues this is also why Nero would kill Poppaea's first child by a separate husband. Therefore, the reason Nero castrated Sporus was because he genuinely believed Sporus was an illegitimate child of Tiberius and therefore a potential claimant to the throne. Now, the reason that he would marry Sporus afterwards and not just, kill him was because Woods points out there's several other examples of Nero using sexual violence to kind of dominate his political opponents. Although in both examples Woods gives, Nero kills those political opponents immediately afterwards. So there you have it. 2 crackpot theories on what the life of Sporus might have really been like. And with the evidence at your disposal, feel free to make up your own crackpot theories in the comments. Winner gets, likes on YouTube. Anyway, just wanted to share that. Hope you all enjoyed. The Sporus one was interesting, actually. It was someone on my Nero video left a comment and got my gears turning, and then kind of actually made me move this up. This was not, this was a video that I wasn't even thinking of making at all, and then I moved it up to being the first one I made after the history of paganism, which I'm glad so many of you seem to enjoy that series, and the channel in general just kind of blowing up as a result of it. I know it's the other videos, but that first video is really what led YouTube to recommending my channel to more people. So very excited to do another deep dive on Proto-Indo-Europeans, something that no one really had any strong opinions on last time. So that'll be very interesting to see how that turns out. But no, I genuinely, I actually am, as much as I'm joking, I actually am interested in it because I don't know, it's this kind of stuff is really fun to me. The fact that I can even do this a little bit as a side project is really cool. That I can say no to gigs because I'm trying to focus on this is really cool and not something I ever thought would happen. I never, I'd recorded all 3 parts of my paganism video before the channel blew up. So I'm so grateful. I'm so glad so many new faces are here. And yeah, I'm going to show you I'm grateful by just making more content. That's what you want. So that's what you're going to get. 10K subscriber special is next. Doing another deep dive on PIE. Already said that. Oh, and hey, the video criticizing Leather Apron now has more views than his original video. So that's cool. That's a neat little thing. I appreciate all you sticking around from the beginning. I appreciate all the new faces as well. And until the next one, take care.